Hello all and welcome back to my channel. My name is Yasmin, but everyone calls me Yaya. And in today's video, I'm going to get into the rise and fall of one of the most powerful corporations in the world that set the standard and template for colonial powers to follow, which is known as the East India Company. And I'll be talking about it while I do my makeup. So when I first learned about the East India Company, I couldn't really visualize what it was, because when you think of a corporation, you think of a brand with a mission statement that sells a niche of products, not a corporation or a company that controls millions of people and has an army of over 100,000. But that's what the EIC was. So how did the East India Company get started? So on the very last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth gave a group of merchants a grant to go over to the East Indies and compete with the Dutch, who were over there capitalizing off of the very lucrative spice market in what is now Indonesia. And so began the East India Company. So the EIC started as a temporary joint stock system in 1612, and then it became permanent 45 years later. And a joint stock company is just a fancy way of saying that instead of raising funds from an individual or a government, they were basically just taking shares from multiple investors and using that to invest in the firm. And this system laid the foundation of the model that many corporations use today. Now, the EIC was primarily a trading company, and its main product was spices, but eventually it moved into selling gunpowder, silk, tea, and even opium. It also established trade routes between Asia and Europe, focusing on the East Indies and then to East Asia, and then they also traded with China. So as the company was expanding, it wasn't just trading spices, it was also acting as a nation state with intentions to conquer much of the Indian subcontinent. And a pivotal moment for the company was the Battle of Plassey, which marked the beginning of the transition of the EIC from a commercial entity to a colonial power. Now, they obviously couldn't just accomplish this via trade. They had a very big army, and they also had administrative power from the British to establish British control over many strips of land throughout India. Now, their armies often outnumbered the British Crown's armies. So we're talking a significant amount of manpower, probably north of 250,000 soldiers working for this private company. And the army wasn't just fighting with the Indians there, they were also competing with other colonial powers who wanted control over the land. Now, the EIC wasn't just trading, like I said, they were also very influential in policy that basically ruled over all of the Indians there. And they affected both the economic and social fabric of British India. They did this via policies like the Permanent Settlement Act, which I talk about in another video, or the Doctrine of Lapse, which gave the EIC permission to take over princely states that didn't have an heir when the rulers of that state died. So between taking the land and influencing the education system in India and implementing unfair tax policies, the East India Company was having its way across India. But it wasn't without resistance, and it didn't just come from Indians. One of the most well-known defiance acts against the EIC occurred outside of India, and it's known as the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was in response to unfair British tax policies, and it was against the EIC's monopoly. And to protest that, 60 American colonists dumped 362 barrels of the East India Company's tea into the Boston Harbor. Now, while this infamous event is very well known and still talked about today, it wasn't the event that took the EIC down. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 marked the beginning of the end for the EIC, and this rebellion lasted for a couple of years and resulted in the death of over 100,000 Indian people. Now, the revolt happened in response to the company's disruption of Indian customs like the caste system, and apparently things got really heated after there were rumors that the cartridges that the Indian soldiers had to rip open with their mouths were greased with beef and pork, which really upset the Hindus and Muslims. And many soldiers in the Bengal army believed that the British were hell-bent on destroying customs and religions of the Indian people. So they had an uprising, and it took excessive control by the EIC's army to regain its possessions. Now, after the EIC failed to control the situation, the British Crown took direct control of India and formally ended the power of the East Indian Company. And that was the beginning of the British Raj, which was direct imperial control over India from the British. So what impacts does the EIC have on us today? So the EIC's success became a template for British colonial rule around the world. The company's influence also influenced global trade that we see today. And the EIC's involvement in opium trade actually led to conflicts with China, and it has shaped Sino-Western relations for generations. Now, probably one of the most influential impacts that the EIC had is the joint stock system model, which corporations follow today, though they don't follow it exactly the same way. So it's not like businesses can register as a joint stock company, but there are shares of a company that different investors can invest in and become shareholders, similar to what the EIC had. So what lessons can we learn from the world's most powerful monopoly? So the EIC's history shows us the need for government intervention and regulation for corporations because they were kind of out of control. And they were exploiting the heck out of the Indian people. We can also recognize that the use of colonial rule to disrupt local customs of the place that they're colonizing will cause disruption and should be avoided. And we should also understand the importance of respecting people's cultures and traditions in international relations and development efforts. And the Indian Rebellion of 1857, that was in response to the violation of Indian customs, demonstrates the power of collective action because it was effective in bringing the EIC down. And finally, we can understand how the legacy of colonialism affects countries today. And I talk about that more in another video. But essentially, a country's right to sovereignty should be respected, and corporations like the EIC demonstrate what happens when you violate that. And their actions have lasting consequences on generations following their fall. So that's pretty much how the world's most powerful corporation came to power and eventually fell. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments what you want to hear from me next. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And as always, all sources in the comments.